Okay, so what we're going to go over today, guys, is just review of something you covered last week. Okay, transport in multicellular organisms. So we're going to look at basically how a plant transports materials, okay, from one place to another. The most important part of this is that it uses specialized cells. We're looking at this from the perspective of a plant is a multicellular organism which has true specialization. That is, some of its cells are different than other cells. They all have different jobs, but they work together. All right, because that's kind of the big theme of the second half of the unit, is that a multicellular organism is still made up of individual cells, but those cells are all very different and have different jobs. Okay. So we need to first off understand how transport within cells is similar and involved in transport in a multicellular organism. All right, so transport within a cell, intracellular transport, is what we worked on Friday. What process does the cell use to transport material from one place to another within the cell? Diffusion. Okay, that's not going to change. And diffusion can still play a part over the scale of a large organism, as long as it's broken up into lots of little small chunks. Okay, something is certainly not going to diffuse, like let's say you eat something, it's not going to diffuse from your small intestine into your brain. Okay, that's way too big a distance for diffusion to work. Okay, obviously it's going to need something to assist it. Okay, that's what our circulatory system is for. Okay, if we're looking at transport into a cell, that can still occur by diffusion as well. It can occur by active transport, or if we're just talking about water moving back and forth, it could move by what process? Osmosis. Okay, and osmosis is the one that's got the biggest role to play in how a plant transports water over large distances, because some plants have to transport it a very large distance. Okay, it's got to go from the roots all the way to the leaves. If we're talking about, like a giant sequoia, okay, that can be over 150 meters tall, that's a long way. Okay? And water's going to have to move that way, and it moves that way for free. Okay? There's nothing within the plant, okay, within that tree, that expends energy to move that water. It is simply moved because water is polar. Okay, and can have that hydrogen bonding, adhesion, cohesion, but also because of the osmotic pressure that can be created in certain layers of the leaf, which we'll talk about when we get there. Okay? Understand how nutrients, that's water, sugar, and minerals, are transported within vascular plants. Which way does sugar have to go in a plant? Down, right. It's made in the leaves, right? That's where photosynthesis can occur. Sugar's not made in the roots, okay? If it was made in the roots, okay, then photosynthesis is a sham because there's no light down there. Okay, so everything is made in the leaves. That sugar just needs to go from the leaves to the roots. What's the best free way to get it to go? Gravity. Yeah, absolutely. Gravity is the easiest way to just go on its own. Okay, we don't need any specialized transport mechanisms or processes or anything like that. Okay, we're also going to look at the structure quickly of vascular plants, basically, roots, stem, leaves, and then obviously again the layers of the leaf, which is really important. Okay, and look at the forces that are involved in transporting those nutrients. Okay, so here's what you need to be thinking about as I go through this really quickly. How is Mr. Coderre going to ask this on the unit exam? Which will be, I put the date up today because I had it in mind and now I forgot. Okay, how is Mr. Coderre going to ask this on the unit exam? Well, I always ask a question about how a plant can transport water, okay, and how a plant can transport sugar, right? What you would need to know for that question is, where is that transport occurring? There's tubes that go up and tubes that go down, and you would need to know their names, and you would need to know what forces are involved and what processes cause it to happen. Okay, so it would be like a 5 or a 6 mark question where you're explaining all of those things. Okay, how is osmosis involved? How is adhesion and cohesion involved? Xylem, Phloem, all of that kind of stuff. Those would be the terms you would want to use when you're answering that question. Okay, so the big problem for a plant is that the resources it requires are spatially separated. That is, they're not in the same space. Okay, water and nutrients are in the dirt. Sunlight and carbon dioxide are in the air. All right, so it's got to have specialized tissues that can acquire those nutrients from the different places, but also transport them to where they're needed. Because unfortunately, the stuff that's produced in the leaves is needed by the roots, and the stuff that the roots can get is needed by the leaves. So they've got to have some sort of transportation mechanism that can switch the two positions. Okay. Now, plants have lots of different adaptations for that, different types of root structures, different types of growth patterns. Okay. If you've ever seen like strawberries or raspberries, they tend to crawl okay, they start popping up in different places. And if you have any raspberries in your yard, okay, you'll notice that they just, suddenly 8 feet away from the rest of the raspberries, pops this little raspberry plant, okay, like in the middle of your lawn, okay, because they just crawl. Okay, strawberries are the same way. If you don't keep them under control, they start popping up in other parts of the garden. And it's not because you left one strawberry there and the seeds germinated. It's actually because the strawberry plant is crawling and putting up new feelers in other places. Okay, reason for that? Those things can actually transport nutrients from that new position back to the original plant, okay, and allow both parts to survive. Okay, some plants will store fluids and energy in their chemical energy, in their roots. Okay, so if you have like cassava, which is kind of like a starchy root, okay, that's a rhizome. Okay, carrots, turnips, okay, things like that. Any of those kind of beet-like plants, okay, they're storing starches and sugars in their roots. Okay, which is why beets are sweet. Okay. If we're talking about potatoes, same idea. They don't store it as sugar, they store it as starch. Okay, so it can all be stored in those places. Okay, energy made up here is stored down there, and then the following season, the plant can grow right from the root tissue that stored all that stuff over the winter. Okay. All right. So, one of the biggest things that terrestrial plants, that is ones that live on land, required was a way to support themselves in order to compete for light. Okay, plants compete for light. That's one of their most important resources other than water. Okay, the best way to compete for light is to be taller than the things that are around you. Okay, which is why we see in forests, okay, that trees grow very tall. They're really trying to shade each other out. Okay, they're trying to get the light and prevent other plants from getting it. Okay, so lignin is this cement-like material that basically acts like mortar. How many people have ever laid bricks before? Okay, and if you haven't laid bricks, I'm sure you've seen them. Okay, there's that kind of grayish white stuff that goes in between them that sticks them together. That's mortar. Okay, lignin is like mortar. Okay, it cements the plant cell walls together, especially in tall woody plants, okay, like trees. Right? If you were looking at a smaller plant, like a house plant or something like that, which I don't have anymore, okay, because we had to get rid of them because of COVID. I don't know why, but we had to. Okay? We used to have this whole room full of plants, and I look around and they're not here. I don't know what to do. But if they're a smaller house plant, okay, then they don't have any of those kind of hard trunk or branch-like pieces on them, okay, and so they don't have a lot of lignin. They're going to rely mostly on just the cellulose fibers in the cell wall and the water vacuoles. Did I show you guys the video of the plant recovering from wilting? Okay, I'll show you that. Okay, does that sort of make sense, the importance of lignin? Okay, that's the last slide. Okay, Turgor pressure is what we just looked at, that video of the plant recovering. Okay, Turgor pressure is, okay, the force of those vacuoles from inside, okay, pushing against the cell wall. So this is that same plant. I forget to water it all the time. Well, I used to. Now it's just dead. It's good. Okay, but I used to forget to water it all the time. You can see it's all just limp. Okay, it all looks terrible. All the leaves are all droopy, but it can come right back and have those leaves be facing right back up again, provided this occurs. Right. So this is the plant in its original condition. Okay, down here. Okay, the cell membrane is actually pulled away from the cell wall because there's so little turgor pressure from inside. Okay, as those water vacuoles fill up, it can start pushing against the cell wall again. It can become much more firm. Okay. Than it did before. All right, so should you know what turgor pressure is? Yes, in fact, that's probably what we should write for the function of the water vacuole on your quiz tomorrow if I give you a plant cell tomorrow. Because I've decided whether it be a plant or an animal cell. Okay? But that would be what I would put for the function of that. Okay, now, job of the roots. Okay, roots are there to acquire nutrients and water, but they are also there to anchor the plant. Without them, the plant can be easily uprooted, obviously. Okay? Now, there's different types of roots. There are fibrous roots like these that can kind of go everywhere. They tend to be fairly shallow on most plants, but they can go deeper. Okay? And then there's tap roots. Okay? Those are large single roots that go down really deep. Dandelions have these. Canada thistle have these. Okay? Carrots are obviously a tap root. Okay? Things like that. What about a big tree? Are they going to have this or this? Yeah, generally a tree has a fibrous root. It needs to have contact with lots of surface area because it needs to, first off, get lots of water, and secondly, it has a much bigger exposure to wind and weather and things like that. Excuse me. So having the big surface area to grip is better for that. Okay, a taproot can be worked free. I mean, if you've ever tried to pick a carrot, okay, like just a little bit of a wiggle and it can come right out. Okay, if you had that with a big tree, every time there was a little bit of wind, they'd all either snap off or come out. Okay, so they obviously don't have that. Okay. The advantage of a taproot is they usually store energy. The advantage of a fibrous root is they can not only go further away from the plant, but they often have little nodules in them that contain bacteria that can actually take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into nitrates, which the plant uses to make proteins. Okay. So they can do that as well. Okay, the stems. Okay, main purpose of the stem is to support the plant. Okay, to support its growth, to get it above the other plants, things like that. Okay, and it's also to transport, because that's where your phloem and xylem are. That's where all the tubes that conduct water and sugar and stuff are going to be found in the stem. Okay, there's going to be a lot of lignin in there if this is a type of plant that has more of a woody structure to it. Okay, if it's more of a fleshy plant, then there won't be as much lignin. Okay, and they typically don't get very tall. Okay, plants without a lot of lignin are going to be limited to probably 3 or 4 feet, okay, at the most, right? Corn, okay, is something that would have a fair amount of lignin. Corn can obviously get fairly tall, okay, but the stalk is very strong. Bamboo would be another one, right? Like it's a very, very strong stalk. Okay, and then the leaves. Okay, so layers of the leaf again here. Okay, layers of the leaf are super important because it's, again, an example of a multicellular organism with specialized cells. So that top layer, okay, of the plant is the epidermis. Those cells have one job, and that is to secrete the waxy cuticle that seals the leaf and keeps the moisture in. Now, keeping the moisture in also keeps moisture out. Okay, plants cannot absorb moisture through their leaves because of this waxy cuticle. But the advantage of the waxy cuticle is, okay, when water hits the leaf, it beads and runs off and then falls onto the ground right where the roots are. Okay, so it works out pretty well that way. Okay, underneath the epidermis is the palisade layer. You don't have to remember the word mesophyll as long as it says palisade layer. I'm good with that. Okay, so the palisade layer is going to be all these vertical cells, okay, and they're going to be packed in really tight because the job of the palisade layer is to carry out what process? Photosynthesis. Okay, that is basically the only job of the palisade layer. That's why there's so many cells packed in there, why they're so rich in chloroplasts. They've got to carry out all of that photosynthesis there. Okay, now we will actually see this tomorrow in the cell anatomy lab. One of the slides you're going to look at is the layers of the leaf, and you'll see that I'm not full of crap. That it actually does look like this. Okay, when you see it through the microscope. All right, underneath that layer is what we call the spongy layer. So a plant's leaf does have a top and a bottom. Okay, the top is the part that usually faces the sun because that's where the palisade layer is going to be. If a plant's leaf is flipped over, it's really not very good for it. Okay, sure, it can still carry out photosynthesis, but it's not going to do it as well, and it's going to lose more moisture as well. Okay, so on the middle here we have the spongy layer. The cells are not densely packed. In fact, they're spaced quite widely, and they make big spaces between them, and it's much like a sponge in appearance. Okay, so there's gaps and stuff. Okay, in those gaps are where you're going to find the carbon dioxide and water and salts. Okay, and all the things that come up from the roots are going to be in there. Okay, that's where all of the exchange of gases is going to occur from. All right, so carbon dioxide is going to be brought in, oxygen is going to be let out. Okay, and this is also where the osmotic pressure that brings water up gets set up. Okay, is in this spongy layer. So the spongy layer's got lots of jobs. Okay, primarily to do with getting transport going. It doesn't actually do any of the transporting, but it gets a lot of it going because it sets up that osmotic balance. It allows the exchange of gases and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, within the spongy layer, you're going to find some of the transport tissue. That would be phloem and xylem. Yeah. Okay, so phloem and xylem, remember that the xylem is the one that is on the inside and it's carrying the water. The phloem is the one that's on the outside, it's the one that's carrying the sugar. Okay, but all the veins that go through a leaf have that in them. That is what they are, in fact. It's just phloem and xylem. Now, on the lower epidermis also does the same thing as the upper epidermis. It secretes the waxy cuticle. Embedded within the lower epidermis are going to be these guys, okay? The stomates, made up of 2 guard cells. I always have a question on the unit exam asking you to explain how a stomate works, okay? Because it involves not only understanding specialized cells, but also the process of osmosis, because it is the process of osmosis that opens and closes the stomates. Okay? A plant does not have conscious control over whether it's allowing water to evaporate or not. All of that is done automatically, okay, just by using osmosis. Okay? All right. Now, the other part of this, okay, and for some reason I don't have a picture of it, but if we were looking at a leaf, that's not too bad. Okay, this would be the blade. Okay, so if you imagine a leaf as a shovel, okay, this is the blade of the shovel, this is the stalk, okay, and the petiole is the part where the leaf comes off from the branch. Okay, I've never asked anyone to label that, which is why I haven't labeled it here, just so you know the terms. Okay, the blade is the big fat part of the leaf that does all the important stuff. Okay, if we have a C4 leaf, that's what you would have in a cactus. Okay, cactus is structured a lot differently in order to preserve water. Okay, so they still have those same layers, but they have them wrapped around their vascular tissue, and there's far more kind of open gaps, okay, within the tissue of the cactus. Right, their epidermal layers tend to be thicker and harder, okay, and they obviously secrete a thicker, harder, waxy cuticle as well. If you've ever touched a cactus, you kind of know that it feels a lot different than the leaf of another plant. Okay, in fact, the leaves of a cactus are actually its what? Actually, it's thorns. Okay? The leaves have actually evolved to no longer carry out any photosynthesis. All the photosynthesis is done from the fleshy part of the cactus, and it's actually the thorns that used to be the leaves. Okay? Why does the cactus have thorns? Yeah, protection. It keeps things from eating it. Okay. Now, it doesn't keep everything from eating it. Small birds can still get in between the thorns. Okay, and some will even nest inside, like a saguaro cactus. Things like that, but it'll keep most animals from eating it, with the exception of antelope. Okay, around here, a little south of here, okay, antelope, like pronghorn antelope around Lethbridge, they actually eat cactus. Okay, their mouth is like a shoe, like leather, really, really hard, and they can just bite down on the thorns and they just break. That's an evolutionary battle that is ongoing. Okay, cactus wins a little bit, win the battle but not the war, kind of thing. Okay, so those are our layers of the leaf. Make sure you know them. Okay, so epidermis, palisade, spongy. Okay, epidermis. Okay, and know the stomates, guard cells. Okay, and we'll talk about how those guard cells work. Okay, here in a minute. Now, transport of water within the plant. So you've got this diagram. You also have in your notes package the labeling of each of the numbers. Okay, so you know what each number corresponds to in the notes. Okay, we'll start with number 1, which is showing the water being absorbed by the roots. Okay, that is actually set up by osmosis. Okay, the plant will actually put a fair amount of salt near the surface in order to draw water towards it. Okay, and that's how water gets absorbed through the roots. Okay, so it gets brought in through there. Okay, and then it'll get pushed up the plant. Now, it gets pushed up the plant because once that salty kind of balance is achieved by bringing water in, okay, as water evaporates from the leaves, the salt that was there in that water gets left behind, okay, because the salt doesn't evaporate. The salt stays, the water evaporates. So salt begins to build up in the leaves, and water always wants to move and balance salt by osmosis. So water gets drawn to the leaves through the xylem. Okay, so it's the fact that water containing some salts evaporates from the leaves and leaves the salt behind, creating a large concentration of salt. That's what draws the water up the plant. It's completely free. The plant doesn't require any energy to make that happen. It just occurs on its own. Okay, so it's a pretty smart process for it to use. Okay, in the leaves, as water is evaporating, carbon dioxide and oxygen are being exchanged. Carbon dioxide is being brought in and broken down in photosynthesis, turned into sugar, the byproduct of which is oxygen, which leaves through the stomates. So carbon dioxide comes in through the stomates, okay, and as that process occurs, water and oxygen are released through the stomates the other way. Once that sugar has been produced, it moves down the phloem. Okay? And it moves that way mostly because of diffusion. Okay? Gravity obviously helps pull it down, but mostly there's a lot of sugar in the leaves and not a lot of it in the roots, and it's needed in the roots. So there's some diffusion that can occur, okay? But mostly it's just the fact that sugary sap is heavy and gravity just pulls it down through the phloem. Okay? And then it will arrive down here at the roots, and all cells do this process, but it's just showing it here in the roots. This is cellular respiration, the process by which sugars are broken down to release their energy. Okay? Obviously, a lot of that occurs in the roots, but it also occurs in the leaves as well. Okay, now to get the idea here, the xylem cells, the ones that carry the water up, are incredibly small. Okay, so these are all xylem vessels. Okay, these big ones as well as the small ones. To give you an idea, this is 100 micrometers. Okay, so this little green line is 100 micrometers. So each one of those big holes is somewhere around 40 micrometers, maybe 50. Okay, is that pretty small? That's really important. As we talked about in the chemistry unit, when we talked about the polar nature of water, that cohesion and adhesion, those hydrogen bonds are not very strong. If the tubes were really big, they would never, those processes would never be strong enough to hold up that column of water. It would be way too heavy. But since that column of water is only a few micrometers across, it's not very heavy. And so the hydrogen bonds are strong enough to hold the water in place without it falling back down the tubes. So as long as the tubes are microscopic, that process works.
In the diagram of the tree with the steps,
yep,
like on the right,
mm-hmm.
On the roots, on
mm-hmm.
the right side, it shows oxygen going in through the roots.
Yes, oxygen can be absorbed through the roots. Carbon dioxide can go out through the roots. It's water that can't be exchanged. So there's, like, unless the ground is completely saturated, there are lots of air pockets within the dirt, and they're going to hold those same gases. Yeah? And that's actually one of the problems. If we get a prolonged rain or the roots of a tree get submerged for too long, the tree dies. A tree can drown just like we can, okay? Just not in the same kind of manner, right? It slowly drowns because it can't exchange, its roots can't breathe. Right? They can't exchange those gases in a liquid environment. They can in a gaseous environment because they're a terrestrial plant. Yeah? Okay, so size of those tubes making sense? Okay. So those notes we already went over. So skip over that. Okay, so transport within the plants. So within any stem, whether it's the trunk of a tree or the stem of a little tiny plant, okay, you're going to have xylem tubes in the middle and you're going to have phloem tubes on the outside. The phloem tubes are actually alive. Okay? The xylem tubes are actually dead phloem because a tree, and any plant for that matter, grows by adding layers to the outside. It doesn't grow from the middle. Because if it grew from the middle, it would always crack. Okay? Because it would be expanding always and the outer layers would crack. Okay? So it always grows by adding to the outside, which is why when you cut down a tree, you can see the rings. Okay? Those rings represent the outer layer of the tree year by year. Okay, we added another layer on, we added another layer on. Okay, you can analyze the history of the climate of an area when you cut down a really old tree. Okay, and they've done this on like some of the really giant sequoias in California and places like that. Okay, they can tell that, oh, well, there was like a really cold snap for a couple of years here where this tree grew very little. These rings are really close together, so the tree didn't grow very much. And then suddenly conditions were really good, and the tree rings are suddenly really wide for a few years. Okay? And so they can actually track and trace, okay, within those layers what the conditions were like over those years. Okay? So we are looking at the plant. We know that the phloem is on the outside. That is where the sugary sap is. Okay? And the xylem tubes are on the inside. Okay? Which is why even in the wintertime, sometimes you'll see deer chewing on the bark of a tree. Okay? Because they're actually trying to get at the semi-frozen sap. Okay? The sap's not running anymore, but it's kind of frozen within the phloem tubes during the winter, and they'll actually chew the bark off for food. Okay, so making sense as to where they are. All right, so on a test, if I ask you, what are the tubes and what do they transport? You're going to say xylem transports water which way? Up, using osmosis and the polar nature of water, hydrogen bonds, cohesion, adhesion. Okay, that would be your explanation there. Okay, what does the phloem transport? Sugars, which way? Using gravity. Perfect. Okay, that's what I would be looking for if I asked you that. Okay, so the xylem transports water up the plant. Okay, we were talking about this. There can be cohesion, a hydrogen bond between two water molecules, adhesion, a hydrogen bond between water and the inside of the xylem tubes, all supporting that column of water, okay, and not allowing it to fall back down, okay, but also obviously osmosis plays a big part, okay, that is that as water evaporates in the spongy layer through the stomates and then leaves the salts behind in the spongy layer, okay, that solution becomes more concentrated and that pulls more water up the stem to balance the concentration. Okay, so really important that you're able to explain that process as well. All right, and then for the phloem, okay, any sugars that are synthesized in the leaves go down through the phloem, okay, this is where we harvest sap to make maple syrup. Okay, so if you've ever seen when they do that, they put those taps, okay, into the side of the tree. They don't go in very far. Okay, we all envision that they're like pounding these taps like deep into the tree. You don't want to go deep into the tree because then you'll get into the watery part. Okay, and the sap will come out really runny, and that won't make good syrup. So they only tap the phloem, which is just the outside layer, okay, of the tree, and it only comes out very slowly. Okay? We also have this idea that once they put the tap in, you just like open it up and maple syrup gushes out of the tree. It's really, really slow, which is why real maple syrup is expensive. Okay? And you can buy Miss Butterworth, or Aunt Jemima at the store for a couple of bucks because it's just high fructose corn syrup. Okay? But if you get real maple syrup, okay, it's a lot more expensive because it's not as easy to supply. Right? It takes a lot longer to harvest it, okay? And tastes better. But, okay, so there's still a little bit of osmosis and diffusion required because if the sap gets too thick, it can actually jam up. Okay, so there will be some diffusion from the xylem across into the phloem to thin the sap as it goes. Okay, there's also sieve plates within the phloem. Okay, they're basically just grates, and if any solid crystals start to form in the sugary sap, okay, the weight of the sap above will crush them against the sieve plates and keep them from blocking the phloem. Okay. All right. Okay. Did you guys do those questions the day Mr. Vander had these up? No? Okay. Answer those questions real quick. Okay. Give you a few minutes and then we're going to do the pre-lab. I'll get the computers and stuff here. All right. So what process/properties are used in both intracellular transport and transport in multicellular organisms? Okay. Well, we're seeing for sure two. What are they? Diffusion and osmosis. Okay, active transport is not used over the scale of a large organism because all it does is move materials across the membrane using those little gates, those little proteins, transport proteins that can change their shape. Not used on a whole organism scale. Okay, because the energy involved would be enormous, right? Whereas the other two passive processes can still work, okay, for that. So they're used obviously just to move materials. Okay, for osmosis, they can obviously be used to move water from the roots to the top of a tall tree. Number two, if you're tapping a maple tree to harvest sap for syrup, which part would you hit? Phloem or xylem? Phloem, yeah, that's where the sugary sap is, right? And it's on the outside of the plant. Okay, in the leaf, why are so many cells packed together near the surface of the leaf? How are they continually supplied with water? Okay, so why in that layer is it where they're packed really tight?
Moisture doesn't leave the leaf.
Okay, sorry, it wasn't the layer I was thinking of. No, you're right. The epidermis secretes the waxy cuticle. That keeps the moisture in. What's the layer where they're packed really, really tight together? Palisade layer. Okay, because the palisade layer is carrying out what process? Photosynthesis. So the more cells, the more chloroplasts you can pack into that area that's really close to the light source, the better, because the more photosynthesis you can carry out. Okay, and they're continually supplied with water because you've got the xylem coming up in the veins into the spongy layer, and if there's water in the spongy layer, it can also move into those cells as well as obviously evaporating out through the stomates. Okay, for number 4, would a plant be able to transport water to its leaves more easily, or that's supposed to be or less easily, on a humid day?
If the plant doesn't need to consume energy in the first place to move it, shouldn't it not make a difference?
It makes a little bit of difference. Think about diffusion a little bit. If I've got a lot of moisture in the air, how easy is it for water to move from a place where it's already fairly concentrated to another place where it's already fairly concentrated? It's not. Yeah. So if it's really, really humid, it can be more difficult for a plant to evaporate water. Now that doesn't mean it's not able to carry out photosynthesis. It just means that there's going to be a bit of a water imbalance and transport will slow down. Okay? Obviously plants in the jungle are in near 100% humidity all the time and they still survive. Okay? When it gets cooler at night, then more of the evaporation can occur because we get, the air will dry out a little bit because of the condensation that will occur. All right, number 5, you have a plant that does not look very full. So it only has a few stringy branches. What would you do to give it a more full appearance? Anybody ever seen a hedge maze? I mean, you've probably seen a corn maze, and around here we don't have too many hedge mazes. Okay, when you make a hedge, right? You guys all know what I mean by a hedge, right? Like this, they're made out of essentially like a tree, but you can shape them. Okay, so the way you get that to happen is when you first plant them, it's like 2 little sticks. Okay, and you allow them to grow a little bit, and then you trim them off, and then they grow from below. Okay, because you cut off the buds that are at the top, so buds that are lower down have to grow instead. And so the plant starts to fill out a bit more because it's growing from further down rather than always adding to the end and just getting taller. Because if a plant's given a choice, it's going to get tall, right, in order to get to light. But if you start cutting off the top buds, it'll grow from further down and it'll fill out more. It'll grow more leaves lower down, and it gets to the point where you can make a wall out of a tree. Okay, that's what a hedge is. Okay? If you just keep trimming them all the time, they just keep growing from further back in and they get really, really thick. Okay, as a result. So you can't see through them, you couldn't walk through them or anything like that. Okay? That's how you would do that. So you just keep trimming it. It's the same with your grass. If you don't cut your grass, it'll get long and stringy. If you cut it regularly, it gets more full because it grows from further down all the time. All right, questions on any of those? All right, we'll leave it at that.